Okay, Professor Chomsky, with the recent release of films such as Loose Change and 9/11 Mysteries on the internet, do you think there's much weight behind the claims that the US government had either insider knowledge or played a role of the attacks of September the 11th, or do you sideline these as merely anti-Republican propaganda?
Well, there are two different versions of that theory. One is that the government had some information about 9/11, an impending attack, and didn't do much to try to stop it, or maybe anything. That's one idea. Another idea is that the government was actually actively involved in carrying out the terrorist attacks of 9/11.
Yeah.
Now, the first proposal is, first of all, in one version, universally accepted. So even if you look at the official 9/11 government report, it points out repeatedly that there were opportunities that were not taken to avert a terrorist attack. And in fact, this goes back right into the Clinton years. So from the first, remember that the first attempt to blow up the World Trade Center was in 1993, and it came pretty close to succeeding. Poor planning, it didn't succeed. If it had succeeded with a little better planning, according to the building engineers, might have killed many thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands. And it was a much broader plot. It was an attempt to blow up the tunnels that link New York City to New Jersey, across the river, Hudson River, blow up the FBI building and so on. It was aborted, but barely. And ever since then, it's been pretty obvious that the country is vulnerable to terrorist attack. There are technical books published through the 90s by MIT Press, for example, which are almost cookbooks of how to carry out a terrorist attack. And very little was done to avert this danger. The leading official in the CIA who was responsible for tracking Osama bin Laden wrote several books anonymously, but finally identified himself. He's Michael Scheuer, has been very, very bitter, writes very bitterly about the failure of the Clinton and particularly the Bush administration to take steps that could avert a terrorist attack. And incidentally, we know very well that Bush and Blair and their colleagues just don't care very much about terrorist attacks. We know this from what they've been doing in the last few years. They are consciously acting in ways which increase the threat of terror significantly. So the invasion of Iraq, for example, was taken with the anticipation that it would probably increase terror and nuclear proliferation. We know that from the reports of, actually it was known at the time, but there's more now, from released reports of intelligence agencies, from strategic analysts and others, and the dynamics are pretty clear. Well, it did so. According to the latest study that just came out from two terrorism specialists, Peter Berg and Paul Cruikshank in the United States, using mostly government data, the Iraq effect, as they call it, the effect of the Iraq war on terror, was to increase it by 7-fold. It's quite an increase, and focused on countries and places involved in the war. London is familiar with this, despite attempts by Blair to deny the obvious. So there, and that continues. I mean, if there are now threats to serious threats to attack Iran. Well, the Iran effect is likely to be far greater than the Iraq effect. And we can give many other examples. It's not that governments want terror, it's not a high priority. Protecting their own citizens from terror is simply not a high priority. So it's not all that surprising that from 1993 up till September 11th, 2001, there were very limited precautions taken to avert a threat of terror that was anticipated by intelligence agencies and so on. So that version of the theory is, in a sense, not controversial. And it's the issue is much deeper than these theories indicate, goes right on till today. As for the other aspect, that the government actually was involved in planning and implementing the attacks, I think that's lacks credibility. For one thing, they would have had to been almost insane to try anything like that. The chances of, you just consider a range of conspirators that would have to be involved. The airline companies, plenty of people in the federal government, and so on. The chances of a leak would be substantial. And the effect of a leak would be simply to line them up before firing squads and terminate the Republican Party forever. Furthermore, it's a very chancy operation. You wouldn't know if it's going to succeed. And if they were planning it, the planning would have had to been kind of half crazy. If the goal was to lay the basis for an invasion of Iraq, why not implicate Iraqis? Why implicate Saudis? Therefore endangering the closest U.S. relation with any country in the region, Saudi Arabia, which is where the oil is, the oldest, most valued ally. I mean, that would have been semi-insane planning. There is evidence proposed, but can't review it here, but I'd suggest you take a careful look at it. The evidence roughly is in two categories. Some of it is physical evidence, arguments that the buildings couldn't have fallen if they were hit by an airplane and so on. Well, technical arguments have to be evaluated in their merits. And you can't get the specialist knowledge required for evaluating them by spending an hour on the internet. That's why they have civil and mechanical engineering programs at places like MIT and others. It takes some serious knowledge and understanding. And when proposals are made about an alleged discovery of concerning physical evidence, there's a standard way to proceed. Submit an article on it to a recognized scientific journal, scientific and engineering journal. Then others can evaluate it. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a single submission, except to a real journal, that is. The rest of the evidence is kind of circumstantial. Odd coincidences, why didn't this happen, and so on and so forth. And the problem with that is that that's the kind of evidence you can accumulate about just about any complex event. I mean, by that kind of evidence, you could probably prove that the White House was bombed yesterday. In fact, that's why scientists do experiments instead of taking videotapes of the world. The videotapes of the world are just too complicated. There are too many things happening. And even you can't learn anything much from them. Even in controlled experiments, you do find odd coincidences, unexplained phenomena, and so on. You want to get a sense of that. Take a look at the letters articles, the letters in any reputable scientific journal, and you find critical discussion of controlled scientific experiments that were reported in earlier issues, which sometimes turn out to be wrong. So I don't think that picture is very credible. The first one is not even debatable.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Just to refer back to your Iran effect, there's been recent speculation, both politically and in the media, about Iran, given its status in the Middle East and the power that it yields compared to Afghanistan or Iraq, for example. How honestly realistic do you think a military strike against Iran by the US is likely to happen?
Well, we have no idea what planning is going on within the small and by now pretty desperate clique that is barely holding on to power in Washington. And if history is any guide, they have not informed British intelligence or their favorite allies about what they're planning, if they even know. So we really don't know. I mean, there's one of the reasons for the main reason for government secrecy. You look through, study declassified documents, and you do learn that there is a security interest all the way through. But primarily it's security against the domestic enemy. They don't want their own population to know what they're up to, because if people did know what they're up to, chances are that they'd act to in a dedicated fashion to prevent it. So therefore, you have to keep planning secret from the population, the domestic enemy. And that's what's happening now. We do not know the plans. They're certainly issuing threats very publicly and openly, not only the words, but even the actions. So, for example, the last couple of years, the United States has provided to Israel over 100 advanced jet bombers, openly advertised as capable of bombing Iran and returning. I don't think a word about that has been published in the United States, but it's public information. You can read it in Israeli press. You can read it in the military journals. Certainly, Iranian intelligence knows it. Israel already has, according to its own estimate, air and armored forces that are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power other than the United States. It's not because Israel is capable of doing that. It's because by now it's virtually an offshoot of the United States, particularly a military and high-tech offshoot. Well, that's a serious warning to Iran. Furthermore, deploying major naval forces in the Gulf, right offshore from Iran, is an obvious threat. I mean, if Iran was deploying major naval forces in the English Channel or the Caribbean, you can bet that the United States and London would be pretty upset about it. In fact, they'd go to war. Capturing Iranian officials in northern Iraq, that's a provocation. The United States is almost certainly, we can't prove it, but the evidence is pretty strong, carrying out, is supporting secessionist groups, terrorist groups, in fact, in Iran. Recently there was an attack from Baluchi-based, Pakistani-based terrorists. Azeri groups are being supported, others. All that's very provocative. That's all over and above the overt threats. I should say that if anyone cares, the overt threats to Iran are a crime. They're a major violation of the United Nations Charter, which outlaws the threat or use of force in international affairs. Threat of force is a violation of the Charter. It's a violation of law. In outlaw states like the United States and Britain, where law doesn't matter much, that's not, there's very little comment on that. But definitely the threats are there, and all of this could lead to just an accidental war. The case of the captured British sailors is an example. There are no territorial boundaries in the Gulf that mean anything. You have naval forces there right next door to Iran. Yeah, you're likely to have an accident, and an accident can easily escalate and explode. So yes, there is a threat of war. The question that we really should be asking, I think, is there a way to avert it? Actually, there is. A very simple way. You can't prove that it would work, but it's certainly a good start. Turn the United States and Iran into functioning democratic societies. You can tell me about Britain, where I don't know the details, but I know them about the United States and Iran, and you can find them out too. Public opinion in the United States and Iran is very carefully monitored by the leading institution in the world that monitors public opinion. The program on international policy attitudes at the University of Maryland, you can find it on the internet. They did a careful study of Iranian and U.S. opinion on nuclear issues. And very interestingly, they're virtually identical. In both countries, there's an overwhelming majority. In the United States, it's 82% that think that all nuclear weapons should be abolished. What that means is that the nuclear states, like the United States and Britain, should observe their legal responsibility, and it is a legal responsibility determined by the World Court, to take good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons, and not to increase their nuclear capacity as the US and Britain are now doing, but to move to eliminate them. Well, that's supported by 82% of the population in the United States, comparable figures in Iran. If that can't be achieved, very large majorities in both countries think that the Middle East, the entire Middle East, should be turned into a nuclear weapons-free zone. That means Iran, Israel, and U.S. and perhaps British forces deployed in the region should not have any nuclear weapons capacity whatsoever. Okay, that would be a step forward. 75% of Americans think that all threats against Iran should be dropped, and the United States should enter into diplomatic relations with Iran. Incidentally, they think the same thing about Cuba. Again, overwhelming majorities of Iranians and Americans think that Iran should have the right to produce nuclear energy, just as every signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty does, but should not have nuclear weapons. Well, you know, that's the framework for an agreement. All that would be necessary is to turn these countries, and I suspect the same is true in Britain, you can figure that out, but to change these two countries so that they become functioning democracies. That is, societies in which overwhelming majority of public opinion can have an influence on policy. Well, let's even take something weaker. Countries in which an overwhelming majority of public opinion can be reported in the media. As far as I'm aware, none of this has ever even been reported, though it's obviously highly pertinent, and in real democratic societies would be very significant. It's there. You can find it on the internet. You can find it in, dissident literature. I've written about it. I give talks about it. Other people do, but that's kind of on the margins. Try to find it in the mainstream press. Do an internet search. I don't think you will. Nobody's found it. Well, that's we certainly ought to be able to do something to make our own societies functioning democracies. To claim that we can't do that is absurd. Can we do anything to help Iran become a functioning democracy? The answer is yes, we can. We could listen to the pleas of the very courageous Iranian reformers and democracy activists who are pleading with the United States to call off the threats. That's people like Akbar Ganji or Shirin Edadi and the labor activists, people you don't hear about, but some of the most important and courageous of them. They're saying drop the threats. And they understand, for a good reason, which we can all figure out. When you threaten a government, it's going to react. You threaten a government with attack and destruction, it's called politely regime change. What are they going to do? Especially when the threat is very credible. I mean, it's not like, say, Luxembourg issuing the threat. This is the world's superpower and acting to make the threat very visible, like naval deployments in the Gulf. How do they react? We know. We know how our own governments react when there are much more mild threats. You react with repression. And in the reactionary theocracy that dominates Iran, they react with severe repression. You react with repression. And in the reactionary theocracy that dominates Iran, they react with severe repression. That's why people are recently being jailed. The West bitterly protests the imprisonment. Yeah, rightly, I protest it too. But we should recognize that it's complete hypocrisy. The imprisonment is the predictable result of the actions that the U.S. is taking with the approval of its allies to threaten Iran. Yeah, it's a predictable result, and they keep telling us if we want to hear. So yes, they reacted in the way that's the predictable consequence of our threats, illegal threats. We can improve the circumstances for democracy promotion in Iran by doing what the overwhelming majority of Americans want: withdraw the threats. That'll leave some space for reformists and activists in Iran, and that's what they're pleading for. That's what we can do. No better source. So yes, we can act to improve the prospects for democracy in Iran, so that Iranian public opinion will have an influence on public policy, and we can certainly do it in our own countries. Well, okay, that lays out steps towards alleviation of this crisis, which could be a very severe one. If war breaks out, either planned or accidental, it could be extremely severe. Just recently, one well-known British military historian, Correlli, Barnett, said simply it's going to be World War III. Well, maybe certainly could have an enormous Iran effect. It could lead to indescribable consequences in Iraq, in the region. We might incidentally ask how people in the region feel. That's also been studied in the Sunni states near Iran. The polls were taken, I think, in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, where they don't like Iran very much. Nevertheless, a large majority of the population favors a nuclear-armed Iran over any military action. We certainly can know what Iranians think. So if public opinion made any difference to policy, whether in the region, in the United States, anywhere, there would be no steps towards war and no threats of war. Rather, there would be steps towards improving the possibilities for peace. I don't know if you want me to go into it. We don't have a lot of time, but there have been recent revelations of options for negotiation that were quite serious, that were simply rejected by the United States and incidentally by the European Union. Well, just to mention briefly, in 2003, we now know that Iran approached the United States with proposals to negotiate all outstanding issues, nuclear issues, two-state settlement for Israel-Palestine, which incidentally Iran supports, contrary to what you read, everything. The U.S. reaction was to censure the Swiss ambassador who brought the proposal. Okay, into that. The following year, the European Union entered into negotiations with Iran and actually reached an agreement, a bargain. The agreement was that Iran would suspend the uranium enrichment, which it is legally entitled to carry out. That's agreed on all sides, but they would suspend it. And in return, the European Union would provide, I'm now quoting the words, firm guarantees on security issues. Well, security issues is a term that's well understood. That refers to U.S.-Israeli threats to attack Iran, which are, of course, illegal. So the European Union, its side of the bargain, was provide those guarantees. Well, Europe didn't live up to its side of the bargain, probably under U.S. pressure. So U.S. experts on the topic argue. Anyway, they didn't live up to it. And after that, Iran withdrew from its side of the bargain. Yeah, it's not, the way it was described in the West is Iran broke the agreement. Well, not exactly true. And that continues. The West adores President Ahmadinejad. Every crazed phrase he comes out with, big publicity. Ahmadinejad has nothing to do with foreign policy. That's in the hands of his superior, the Ayatollah Khamenei, who has, you don't read his statements very often. For example, his statement that Iran supports the Arab League position on Israel-Palestine, namely full normalization of relations with Israel within the framework of the international consensus on a two-state settlement that the U.S. and Israel have blocked for the last 30 years. I haven't seen that reported. Actually, I have a little bit, just a couple of reports in the Financial Times, London Financial Times, but no, it's not on everyone's lips. And internal to Iran, if you read specialists on the topic, there's plenty of controversy and openings. And we could assist in positive developments if that were the goal, just as actions could be taken to reduce the threat of terrorism, if that were the goal. If it's not the goal, of course, you proceed with aggressive militarism, which is likely to very likely to heighten the tensions and the consequences, which could be awesome.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. I'd like you to comment on the issue of climate change, which some people are saying is changing very rapidly into climate disaster, and not in 100 years, but in maybe a few decades, and what kind of impact that's going to have on our capitalism, our late Western capitalism, and all the things that are linked to it, like the war on terror, and the issues that come out of it, like the terrible competition there will be for dwindling resources and energy as climate change bites. Thank you.
Well, of course, that's a major issue right now, even at the G8 meetings. By now, I think there's very little doubt that human activity is significantly impacting the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, of soot and other particle matter and so on, which is heating the Earth probably to dangerous levels, maybe to catastrophic levels. There's also these are what are called nonlinear processes. Small change can lead to a massive effect, and it could happen suddenly. It could be delayed, but it's likely to be very significant and severe. As usual, the major victims will be the poorest people. It's expected that the worst effects will be in places like sub-Saharan Africa or Bangladesh or arable areas of Pakistan and so on. Or near many small countries might just disappear, go underwater. The richer countries will, as usual, find certain ways to adapt, may even partially benefit. So Canada is looking forward to opening the Northwest Passage and declaring sovereignty, which it never cared about before because it was, ice-filled. But the effects will certainly be significant. And one thing we can be confident about is that the longer we delay in doing something about it, the worse they're going to be. Right now, the U.S. alone is dragging its feet on doing something about it. This is incidentally another one of those cases, and there are many, where when we talk about the U.S., it's kind of misleading. The U.S. government is dragging its feet. The U.S. population for years has been strongly in favor of taking aggressive action about this. For example, the Kyoto Protocol was strongly supported by the population, rejected by the government, both the executive and Congress, bipartisan, rejected by the government, strongly approved by the population. In fact, so strongly approved by the population that at the time of the 2004 presidential election, a majority of Bush voters thought that he supported the Kyoto protocols. A reason, well, it's such an obvious thing to support that our man, this nice guy who you want to meet in a bar, he must support them too. Well, that tells you something about American democracy. For one thing, about the elections. The public relations firms that run the elections are very careful to marginalize issues, keep them off the table, and to focus on what are called qualities. Is he a nice guy? Would you like to meet him in a bar? Is he sort of friendly, and so on and so forth? Does he look you straight in the eye? That kind of thing. Is he religious enough? But not where do they stand on issues. That's too dangerous because the public disagrees on a host of major issues, mentioned a couple, with the elite consensus. So therefore you got to keep the public marginalized. And they are. This is one example. What would the effects be? Well, we can't predict in detail, but we can anticipate that they'll be severe. Will this lead to wars? Well, it's already happening, so we don't have to predict that. The struggle and the conflict in Darfur, for example, which is horrendous, is in certain respects a global warming war. Regions that had been shared by farmers and nomadic groups are now declining disappearing. There's a struggle over territories, and that's leading to a lot of vicious atrocities. It's not the only factor, others are, but it's exacerbating the conflict in significant ways. Take resource wars. Well, one of them, we're now, right now, in fact, happens to be the 40th anniversary of one major resource war, namely Israel-Palestine. That's a pretty arid area. In one of the major water resources is the Jordan River, or what used to be the Jordan River. There isn't much of a Jordan River left anymore. It's kind of a trickle, but it used to be a river. What happened? Israel essentially hijacked the river. It took where the waters fall down a big rift into the river, they were simply picked up by the Israeli, what's called the National Water Carrier. Big pipeline goes down to the Negev. And if you want to find the waters of the Jordan, you look in that pipeline. The 1967 war, to a significant extent, had to do with control over water resources. That includes both the headwaters of the Jordan and also the aquifer, this big aquifer, which is under the West Bank, and it's sort of near the official border. And Israel wants to use the aquifer. It had already been tapping into it before the 67 war, but after the 67 war, it controlled it. By now, Israel controls the West Bank aquifer, and you look at the figures, I don't have them in my head right now, the overwhelming majority of that water goes to Israeli Jews, not Palestinians. In West Bank settlements, you find illegal settlements in the West Bank. You find nice lawns, swimming pools, so on and so forth, plenty of water. In a neighboring Arab village, people may have to either get their water brought in trucks, which is prohibitively expensive, or walk for 3 hours to a well somewhere up in the hills where they can get some water and bring it back home. This is right next door. Same was going on in Gaza. The current Israeli plans, and I should really to be accurate, they are U.S.-Israeli plans. Israel can do nothing without the massive diplomatic, military, economic, and ideological support from the United States, and the tacit agreement, silence of Europe, which goes along more or less, apart from a couple of words. So the U.S.-Israeli plans, the current ones, are to annex the regions which happen to control the West Bank aquifer, what's called the separation wall, which is now an annexation wall officially, is intended to annex regions behind the wall, which include much of the arable land in the West Bank, and also are the kind of nice suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, but also happen to control the water, the West Bank aquifer. That essentially that's only one piece of the annexation proposals. Very small. Israel's also planning to annex the Jordan Valley, again, arable land and what's left of the water. So yeah, there was a water war 40 years ago. It's now its 40th anniversary. And we can expect a good deal more of such things. I mean, take the invasion of Iraq, for example. Except for fanatics like Tony Blair and a lot of the press, it's pretty obvious that a major goal, if not the major goal, was to increase U.S. control over the oil resources of the region. I mean, that's transparent. But it's more than that. Iraq also has water resources, which are scarce in the region. That's why Iraq was the cradle of Western civilization, Mesopotamia. It had ample water resources, and they're a precious resource and going to become an even more precious resource in the future. Similar things are happening in India and Pakistan and elsewhere. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and that's a serious problem. The problem of the utilization of water resources in the future is going to be very serious. And one of the anticipated environmental effects of global warming is to heighten these dangers, to reduce them. So we can expect, already have had water wars in addition to other resource wars. These things, exactly how avoidable this is, we don't know. I mean, some scientists argue that we've maybe even passed a critical point where not too much can do about it. But we can, once again, be confident that the longer the delay, the worse the effects are going to be, primarily for the poor, as usual.
Professor Chomsky, following up on what you said about Israel-Palestine, Jimmy Carter, the former USA president, recently in his book, he described the situation in Israel-Palestine as an apartheid system. To what extent do you agree on that?
To what extent do I agree with? I didn't hear the last word.
With the description of the situation as being an apartheid system.
Yeah. Well, there was a huge furor about Carter's use of the word apartheid, which is, again, pure cynicism. Terms used regularly in Israel. You can read it in the editorials of Israel's leading newspapers and commentary by leading analysts and so on, referring to the West Bank. Actually, there are things to be said about Israel proper, but let's put that aside. The occupied territories are commonly described as a system of apartheid. In fact, some describe it as much worse than apartheid, including Ronald Kasrils, one of the leading Jewish, incidentally, South African opponents of apartheid, courageous man, minister in the government, traveling in the West Bank. He says it's worse than apartheid ever was. But the use of the word apartheid for the West Bank is at least appropriate and not controversial. And the hysterical reaction to it in the United States is a sign of the decline of democracy. In a functioning democratic society, people ought to know that. But it's the kind of part of the ideological sign of it. What about the rest of the book? Actually, he gave a pretty accurate description of what it's like in the occupied territories, which is rare. That's sometimes done, but rare. The book actually had, there were hordes of people trying to find some error in the book to discredit it. There's article after article finding some trivial phrase that you could misinterpret. Now, there is actually one serious error in the book, but that's been totally ignored. The one serious error in the book is Carter's reference to Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And what he says is the invasion was taken in response to Palestinian terrorism in the north of Israel. Well, that's the conventional line, and it's a total fabrication. All the documentation is fully available. It was available in 1982 and 83. There was a ceasefire initiated by the United States, incidentally. The Palestinians lived up to it. Israel didn't. They continued their regular attacks in Lebanon, often killing lots of people, in an obvious effort to elicit some PLO response, Palestinian response, which could be used as a pretext for the invasion. If you want precision, there were two very light and symbolic retaliations, period. The rest of it was all Israeli attacks. A lot of it was reported, in fact. Again, killing people, bombing, and so on. Well, when they couldn't get a pretext for the invasion, they just invaded anyway, with U.S. support, killed maybe 20,000 people, destroyed a large part of southern Lebanon, all the way up to parts of Beirut. Well, Carter repeats the conventional falsification about this, and that's the one serious error in the book, but nobody's ever mentioned it, because it's considered appropriate to fabricate in support of state policy. That's a very important principle, has to be preserved. We have to have the right to lie in support of state crimes. So that error is ignored. There was also one major contribution in the book, which was also ignored. Carter, I think, is the first person in the mainstream, it's been discussed in dissident circles, but the first person in the mainstream to report and give the evidence for the fact that Israel instantly rejected the roadmap of the quartet. The quartet is U.S., UN, European Union, and Soviet Union who established the so-called roadmap, which is politely described as George Bush's vision as to how to proceed to resolve the conflict. Well, standard line is, terrible Arabs didn't live up to the roadmap. In fact, Israel instantly rejected the roadmap, and that's quite important. One of the pretexts for strangling Palestinians, Britain and the rest of Europe are involved in this too, punishing them for voting the wrong way in a free election in January 2006, severely punish them. One of the pretexts is that the party with the plurality of votes, Hamas, doesn't accept the roadmap. Well, it's rather important that Israel rejected it instantly. How did they reject it? By, in the usual deceitful way that governments use, formally accepted it and then immediately added 14 reservations, which completely eviscerated. You can read them in the appendix to Carter's book. Actually, they have been available for years, and people like me talk about them, but never entered the mainstream. Okay, it entered the mainstream with Carter's book, and it's very significant, right for today. I haven't seen a mention of that. So the two most important parts of his book, as far as I'm aware, are unmentioned. One, what he revealed about this crucial matter of the roadmap. And when I say Israel rejected it, I again mean the United States and Israel rejected it. Israel's rejection was approved by the United States. So yes, the U.S. Undermined the roadmap that's supposed to be Bush's vision. Those two, the most important contribution of the book and the one serious error in the book, passed without comment, which tell us something about our own intellectual culture, about our universities, for example, where the intellectual culture is formed and developed. There's a principle which says it's appropriate, in fact even noble, to lie in support of state crimes. It's criminal to tell the truth that would reveal the nature of state crimes. I'm purposely exaggerating, but not too much. And this is a clear example of it. So yes, apart from this, Carter's book was, good, reporting things that ought to be known, but that aren't known, and was therefore a contribution. It's, speaking about public opinion again, it's notable that though the book was bitterly lambasted in commentary in the press and editorials and so on, it was at the top of the bestseller list.
Mr. Chomsky, from international relations to education, because this talk was also going to be on the commodification of education and the increasing role of neoliberal capitalism in education. And in the UK, we as students experience the effects of neoliberalism inside and outside the the academy. We're facing debt, increased student poverty, casualization of labor, meeting targets at work, greater flexibility in work, we're being fired, there's cuts in seminars, course closures, etc. Now, this year, UK students for the first time started paying top-up fees, that is £3,000 a year, top-up fees we call them. And we don't have to, we no longer pay them up front, but we have to pay them after where we completed our education once we start earning. Now, our Vice-Chancellor, a respected economist, says that it's too early to say what the effects of this will be. What is your opinion? In other words, what are the long-term effects of a privatized education in your view?
Well, the main immediate effect is to enslave students for the future. If you come out of a college with a big debt to pay off, you're basically enslaved. You're going to have to devote your life and your career to paying off that debt. So suppose you're, say, in law school, and what you really want to do is become a public interest lawyer to defend poor people, people who have no defense, who can't protect themselves in the court. Suppose that's what you're really interested in. But you come out of law school with a huge debt. Well, you don't have a choice to do that. Public defenders are very poorly paid. Your only choice is to go join a corporate law firm. Well, once you join and make a big salary and pay off your debt, well, that has an effect. Once you join a corporate law firm, very likely you're going to internalize its culture, and you will be a different person. Yeah, that's a way to entrap, and the same is true across the board. Furthermore, I think this must be conscious because, even in law, the predictable consequences of actions are taken to be a sign of intention, and we even have some documentary evidence for it. The 1960s are constantly referred to as the time of troubles. There's a good reason for that. They were a period in which countries like the United States and Britain became much more civilized, and that's dangerous. In the United States, I'll keep to that, but it generalizes. In the United States, what happened is that previously marginalized, apathetic people became politically active, started to enter the political arena to press their demands. Furthermore, there were challenges to really illegitimate structures of oppression. Blacks finally, century after the Civil War, got formal voting rights. Took only a century. That didn't end repression and discrimination, but step forward. Civil rights, the South is a very different place from what it was in the 1950s, not the North, but the South. The women's movement began, really took off in later years, but the incipient elements of it were in the 60s, again challenging centuries of repression and domination, which had pretty much been taken for granted. There was opposition to aggression greatly increased. We can't even remember anymore that when the Vietnam War began in 1962, when John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam, hidden with South Vietnamese markings, but it was reported, authorized napalm, initiated chemical warfare programs, which were mentioned by the first speaker, still having their effects, initiated them in 1962 to destroy food supplies and ground cover, and started rounding up ultimately millions of people and driving them into what amounted to concentration camps or urban slums to separate them from the indigenous guerrillas, South Vietnamese guerrillas, who the U.S. knew they were willingly supporting. The intelligence reports are overwhelming. That's war. But there was so little concern or protest that there was no opposition. I can remember at that time, you wanted to give a talk on the war, you maybe could talk in somebody's living room. But it took years before opposition really developed. An active peace movement developed, anti-war movement, years. By the time it developed, South Vietnam had been practically destroyed. And the war had expanded to the rest of Indochina. Well, that initiated a change which is lasting. Opposition to aggression is far higher now. That's why the U.S. and Britain and Iraq can't even begin to do what they got away with in Vietnam. Not even close. The time of when there were 150,000 troops in South Vietnam, there was almost no protest. Now there's substantial protest. In fact, the Iraq War is the first one, I think, in the history of the West, hundreds of years. It's the first one I can remember in which there was massive protest before the war was officially launched. And it had already started, as Blair knew, but was concealing, and Bush knew. But officially launched on March 2003, right before it, there were huge protests. I can't think that's ever happened before. The solidarity movements, which really blossomed in the 1980s, that was an outcome of 60s activism. That's, again, extremely important. Well, it was recognized. That's why it's called the time of troubles. It did civilize the countries. It raised the threat of more democracy. And there was a direct reaction. And if you haven't read it, you should. The best exhibition of it is an important study called The Crisis of Democracy, published by the Trilateral Commission in, I think, 1974, reflecting on the time of crisis, of the time of troubles, the crisis of democracy. Trilateral Commission is it's not the right wing, it's the liberal internationalist wing of elite opinion in the trilateral countries, Europe, the United States, and Japan, major industrial countries. And the study is quite interesting. The crisis of democracy that they see is what they call an excess of democracy. Normally passive, apathetic masses of people who are just supposed to obey orders and shut up, were beginning to show concern for their own interests and actually enter the political arena. And the trilateral scholars concluded that that imposes too much of a burden on the state. So we have to have what they call more moderation in democracy. And then they describe measures, and some of them have to do with the universities. They describe the universities and the schools and the churches as, their words, institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. And these institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young aren't doing their job properly. That's why you have students acting in such a way as to advance civilized values, like women's rights and civil rights for minorities and concern over the environment and opposition to war and violence and so on. You have to indoctrinate students so that that doesn't happen. You have to improve, and in fact, from that time on, various measures have been taken to improve the indoctrination of the young within the school system. Imposing fees, which were mentioned, is just one example. That is has a disciplinary effect, obviously. And the same is true of other aspects of the corporatization of the universities. Of course, it went way beyond that. You mentioned neoliberalism. The neoliberal programs were instituted from mid-1970s, and whatever one thinks about them, you can argue at least about their effects on economic growth. I think you can show pretty definitively that they were harmful to it, but put that aside. The neoliberal programs are directly an attack on democracy. I mean, that's almost explicit, just about every piece of the package. So take, say, privatization, which is one of the great mantras. There are no known economic arguments for it. Could go through that. But privatization does have an effect in diminishing democracy, by definition. When something's taken out of the public arena and put into the hands of private tyrannies, unaccountable private tyrannies, which is what corporations are, then by definition that reduces the space for public decision-making and action. And in a more democratic society, that can have a significant effect. That extends when you reach what's called privatization of services, sometimes called trade and services. It's called trade so as to put it into the rubric of the World Trade Organization. In fact, that's a lead issue right now in negotiations over what's ridiculously called free trade. It's almost nothing to do with free trade. One shouldn't use the word. But what's called free trade agreements, a large part of it has to do with what's called trade and services. What's trade and services? Well, that means privatization of services, not trade. It means handing them over into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, corporations, in other words. What are services? Well, services are just about anything a human being could be interested in. Health, education, resources, water, environment, you name it, almost anything that people could be concerned about, that's services. Well, you take services out of the public arena, where people, at least in principle, have some choice about it, and put them into private hands. You reduce the arena of democratic choice very sharply. The same is true of freeing up capital movement that was controlled under the Bretton Woods system, which was terminated in the mid-70s. And it's well understood by international economists that, in fact, Keynes understood it perfectly well also, that the ability to move capital freely is an attack on democracy for very obvious reasons. It establishes what international economists call a virtual parliament of investors and lenders who carry out moment-by-moment referenda on government policies. If they don't like the government policies, they wipe out the economy by capital flight, by attack on currencies, and so on. And the mechanisms are understood. It also forces countries to hold huge reserves to protect their currency, which slows economic growth. But the main effect is an attack on democracy. In fact, just about every element of the neoliberal package has that consequence. And it's understandable, and it's in large part, I think, a lot of reasons, but one reason is a reaction to the threat posed in the 1960s, to a large extent by students, the threat of freedom, independence, creative thought, and civilizing the society, which is a real threat, has to be contained. Back to the Trilateral Commission, scholars, we have to make sure that the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young do their job properly. And one aspect is the kind of things